صباح الخير وأهلا وسهلا بالجميع. راح أقدم العرض بالإنجليزي بس كل التفاصيل موجودين بالعربي بالتقرير. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, it is my pleasure, my sincere pleasure and my honor to be here with you on behalf of the Regional Steering Group, a group of very distinguished and committed colleagues who came together very early on in this process to guide the preparations for this important event. I have the pleasure of presenting on behalf of the group the main findings which have emerged from the preparatory consultations that were conducted across the region for many months now. As we saw from the animated video just now, we have been working for several months and reaching out to partners across the region and all sorts of stakeholders from a wide variety of backgrounds and disciplines. Some of you we've known for a very long time. Others we have had the privilege of getting to know you in the last few months, and you've brought some fresh perspectives and new ideas to the discussion, and for that we thank you. What I will endeavor to do now is actually present a summary of the views, the opinions, the observations that we gleaned through these many months of consultations with various stakeholders across the region. The presentation is essentially a summary of those views and those comments that we received, and all of that has been fleshed out in much greater detail in the Stakeholder Analysis report, which you received in your packs. I hope that many of you have read it in advance, as we shared it by email last week. But for those who haven't had an opportunity, I really do encourage you to take a look at it, because I think it very well captures all of what's going to be said and discussed in further detail over the next few days. Now, what I will do is focus essentially on three elements. I will be first giving you an overview of the process that led us here today and to this important meeting. And then I will briefly introduce to you the 11 issues which have been identified as the key priorities from the stakeholder consultations across the region. And finally, I will discuss what we hope will come of this process through your active engagement and contributions over the next 2.5 days. So to begin, the preparations. Well, it warms my heart tremendously to see all of you here, because many people have been working very hard for the last year to bring this event together and ensure that you are all with us. We began this process roughly a year ago and started reaching out to stakeholders and governments and civil society organizations, as well as a host of other constituencies across the region. And our goal was really to do a number of things. First, it was to raise awareness about what the World Humanitarian Summit is all about and why we were going to be knocking on your doors and constantly pestering you to come to our meetings and express your views and engage with us. And then secondly, we really wanted to generate interest in the region amongst all of those that we wanted to be involved, and we wanted to ensure that those voices were heard, so we came calling and asking for your help and your engagement in that process. And we've been very fortunate, because I have to say right at the outset that all of you have been quite engaged and committed, and it is through the work that you've done with us that we've been able to reach so many people in the region. So for that, we're very grateful. Now, we couldn't have done any of this without all of you and without the partner organizations that you see represented on the screen. These are a selection of the main counterparts that we engaged with. And most notably, I think one organization merits special attention and an expression of gratitude, and that's the Humanitarian Forum, without which we could not have extended to the many communities and groups that we were able to touch through this process and engage with. So it is a shame, as Dr. Jamila said, that Dr. Hani's not with us here today, but he has very strong colleagues representing him. And you will see also attached to the report in an annex the timeline of consultations that were carried out by the groups listed on this screen, and show us really how far we were able to extend with the reach of the Humanitarian Forum. As I said at the outset, the Regional Steering Group is the body that was composed early on in this process. As with all other regional consultations, we approached our partners in the OIC and the League of Arab States to come together and form a group of humanitarian actors, officials from the region, partners, those who've been engaged, who represent a broad cross-section of stakeholders, to come together and to be partners in this effort, to guide this process, to steer this process, to ensure that we had local ownership and that the voices of our region came out very strongly in all of the consultations. So I have to take this opportunity to thank all of you. Many of you are here with us and some of you could not be, but we really do appreciate your efforts. Now, I think all of us can recognize that civil society organizations are often at the front line of response. They are embedded in the communities that they served, and so we made a very conscious effort from early on to reach out to these organizations because their views and their perspectives were important in shaping what would come out of this process. All told, we were able to hold civil society consultations in 14 countries across the region, which was no small feat. And it was through those consultations, as well as the others, that we really were able to glean a lot of the information that will be presented over the next 2.5 days. Also, we conducted 2 very successful and large, very well-attended regional level consultations with civil society organizations, the last of which was just last month. What we wanted to do, recognizing that those affected by crisis really should be at the core and at the heart of this process, was we made it a priority to include them in the consultations right from the beginning, and to help us steer the direction of these discussions. So we reached out to various communities, refugees, migrants, those who are displaced, any number of different communities that have been impacted by crisis in the Middle East and North Africa region. And we were able to hold what we call focus group discussions in a number of countries. I will highlight in particular those that we did in Egypt, Jordan, Lebanon, Palestine, Syria, and Yemen. And these were really important gatherings because they brought to the table those who are directly impacted by crisis, those who feel the impact and the effects of what we see playing out on our news screens, and we asked them to provide us with their observations and their views. And you will see in the report that we also did a number of surveys with these groups, and the results of those surveys are contained in the stakeholder analysis. We also consulted youth and have integrated youth into this consultation. You will have been received by some very incredible volunteers from youth organizations across the region. Obviously, this demographic is a very important one in the Middle East and North Africa, and we sought to involve them in the process very early on. Through the help of a number of organizations, we conducted online consultations with youth who are far more dynamic and innovative in the way they interact, and so we managed to use new technology to really capture the views and the opinions of a number of young people across the region. Through our very important co-chair, the League of Arab States, we were able to reach member states across the region, and they have really worked very hard and tirelessly with us throughout this process. They've been exceptionally committed, as have the Organization of Islamic Cooperation. But through the League of Arab States, we were able to specifically reach member states, and we did that in a number of ways. We held a special member states briefing in Cairo in February, which was hosted at the League. We also did presentations and briefings to member state representatives in New York and Geneva. And we've had also the privilege of presenting to the Arab League's Social Ministers Council as well as the Health Ministers Council to really get them involved early on and to ensure that they were part of this process, because obviously the views and the feelings and the perspectives of governments are incredibly important in shaping this dialogue and the outcomes of this consultation. We also reached out to our UN colleagues and international NGO representatives who have had a more limited role in the consultations, but have been also very engaged and have been ensuring that their voices and their perspectives as frontline responders, many of them for a number of years working in this region, were also heard. And when we met with them, we actually focused the discussion on one of the issues that came out in the pre-consultations was the need to bridge the divide between humanitarian and development actors. And I'll get into a little more detail further in the presentation on why this is important, but for those working in the field, you will appreciate that bringing these two constituencies together and better harmonizing our work is critical if we're going to be more successful in meeting the needs of people in the region. Our colleagues from the Red Crescent hosted a very important conversation with Red Cross and Red Crescent societies, national societies in Doha in January, where we brought together actors from all of the societies across the region to express their views, having, again, been very experienced technical experts who've been on the ground delivering aid and assistance for decades. So we made sure that we were consulting them and including them in the deliberations throughout this process. Last October, we hosted a high-level roundtable in the Gulf region in Kuwait, actually, to gain perspectives and input from our colleagues and various officials from the Gulf region. And a couple of weeks ago, we managed to assemble about 20 media representatives in Amman to speak to them about what they viewed as the main issues, obstacles, challenges in dealing with humanitarians, and how we could better strengthen our relationship for the benefit of the people that we serve. And we also did, again, seizing on innovative techniques and technologies, we ran an online consultation to consult the average person, those who wanted to have their voice heard and contribute to this process but didn't have an opportunity through one of the more organized consultations, were invited to engage online over a number of weeks. And we had some very special moderators, some very committed individuals who took that on, and it was chaired by Ambassador Hisham Yusuf from the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, who was very committed and dedicated to this process throughout. So all in all, as you can see, we've done our best to extend our reach to many organizations and individuals in the region. And we did, as the video pointed out, we managed to reach over 500 organizations and over 1,200 individuals, which all led essentially to a synthesis of this information into 11 key issues that were considered the priorities from those that we consulted in the region. So what I'll now do is just briefly introduce you to those issues, because these issues have factored into the discussion and will also guide you in your working group sessions over the next 2.5 days. And I have to say that I think for all of you in this room, the issues will not come as a surprise. In fact, we heard this morning from our Undersecretary General and from the distinguished Foreign Minister and our other panelists, a number of these issues raised. And many of you will have been advocating and raising your concerns on these very issues for years in your own work. So you will not be surprised by what you find in the report or what were highlighted as the priorities. One thing we were struck by, though, is that given the diversity of the region, the many countries, the large populations, the different conflicts that are playing out, people were uniformly unified in their hopes and their concerns for the region. And we heard over and over and over again expressions of outrage, sheer outrage at the staggering level of human casualties and suffering in the region. All of them told us that this is unacceptable and that solutions must now be presented to tackle the root causes of these problems and to really look at the issues underpinning people's vulnerability and distress. The message was clear. We heard this morning. We also heard it in the video, that humanitarian aid cannot be a substitute for political action. And I have to underline that this message was expressed over and over and over, loud and clear from everybody that we spoke to. It is no longer enough just to address the symptoms. We need to look at the causes of these problems. We all know, I think, amongst ourselves in this room, what are the issues that are underpinning these vulnerabilities and this distress and these difficult conflicts and these protracted situations in the region. What we need now is to address the root causes so that we can move beyond addressing the symptoms as humanitarians. So, for instance, in Palestine, an issue which is very near and dear to my heart, as my origins are from Palestine, and I had the privilege of serving the United Nations in both Gaza and Jerusalem, where I came into contact with these issues myself on a daily basis, as others in this room may have also done in their careers. Essentially looking at the root causes, tackling what underpins all of this, as we heard from the Foreign Minister today, is an end to the occupation, and finally recognizing and implementing the inalienable right of the Palestinian people to self-determination. So that is looking at the root causes rather than simply addressing the symptoms that come from there. Now, we also heard the same thing from communities in Iraq, from Libya, Syria, Yemen. They were uniform in their call. We don't need just aid. We don't need to be recipients of charity. We need you to actually fix the problems that are causing all of this. So this brought us now to the 11 issues, which I will very briefly highlight to you. The number one amongst them was the protection of civilians. As we heard from our Undersecretary General this morning, the scale and severity of the violence that's taking place in this region disproportionately affects civilians. They are the ones who are bearing the brunt of all of this. And many of them said to us that impunity and the lack of accountability for these violations continues to fuel and embolden those who are committing these violations against us, and this needs to be tackled. It is no longer enough to see some representatives of some countries in the dock facing criminal prosecution for their actions. We must now figure out a way to uniformly apply the standards of international law against all those who violate these regimes. So this collective failure to protect civilians was something that came out loud and clear in the consultations, and it is no wonder, as you will see in the report, that affected communities rated their sense of safety and protection so poorly, because they are the ones who are on the front lines and dealing with this every single day. The other issue, and I think this is perhaps unique to our region, or it disproportionately affects us, is this notion that crises are now protracted and that we have generations of displacement and generations of refugees. We are not talking about issues that start and end within a short period of time, which is essentially what the humanitarian aid system was developed to address. Rather, we are now seeing situations that stretch into years and decades. And this is addressing these problems with Bandaid solutions, humanitarian aid, that, you know, extending immediate relief for immediate needs, which is important and something we should do, is not a feasible way of addressing these problems. We need to find a way to sustainably meet needs and to ensure that that's done with dignity. This was something that came out again from those we spoke to, and particularly the populations who are directly affected by conflict. They asked for systems, mechanisms, responses which allow them to preserve their dignity and to be self-sufficient. They don't want to be recipients of aid. As one person in Palestine said, we're not hungry, we are angry, and we want to see our rights respected. And I think that message was loud and clear across the region. We also, as we heard this morning, need to ensure that the burden is shared by all of those. It's not enough now to place this on the shoulders and the backs of a few governments and a few countries in the region, where we see the impact of this long-term conflict and displacement also creating other problems. Another issue which came out was that we need to empower people who are themselves impacted by crisis by making it so that they can address the situation. They are embedded in these communities. They know their problems, they know their issues, they know their needs better than any of us could possibly know. And so they need to be given a choice in how the response is designed. And a lot of them repeated to us this very important message that their choices or their voices are not necessarily considered when these programs and responses are designed. We also heard about the obstacles that people face in accessing aid. Here, our brothers and sisters in Syria and in the Syrian community were particularly vocal about the difficulty in finding asylum and resettlement in countries where they could go on to establish new lives and rebuild their lives in light of what they've had to face. We also see that the permit regime and the closures, the siege of Gaza, that's also, we were told, affecting people's ability to access the systems and to find safe shelter and places not to be impacted by all these damaging events that are playing out around them. Another very important issue was raised in terms of our colleagues in the humanitarian world facing difficulty in accessing certain areas. Now, some of these reasons are very bureaucratic and mundane, but they actually do affect whether or not people can be reached. Securing visas, gaining security clearance to access certain places is also something that limits our ability to reach those who are often the most in need. Here, our colleagues from the governments were also very vocal in saying that countering terrorism is something that they take seriously. State sovereignty, respecting their borders and their right to make decisions about what happens in their countries is also something that they feel is important and needs to be highlighted. But by the same token, the humanitarian colleagues noted that counterterrorism measures and counterterrorism legislation were having a direct impact on their ability to secure funds, to operate in certain areas. If there were prescribed groups in these areas, they feared not only for their organizations but for themselves. Would they become themselves subject to criminal prosecution for aiding and abetting terrorism one day if their list of beneficiaries hadn't been vetted by the right donor government, or they hadn't been given prior clearance to operate in these areas? Moving on, we saw that emergency preparedness and disaster risk reduction was also something highlighted by constituents in the region as being key. They repeatedly told us that we don't feel prepared for emergencies and that far too little is invested in emergency preparedness. This despite the fact that we know that for all of the money you spend and invest in preparedness, you actually save a great deal of lives and manage to ensure that development gains are not reversed when something does happen. You can't stop disasters from happening, but you can mitigate the response by being prepared. They also cited the fact that we are very slow, or organizations and governments are very slow to respond to the early warning signs, and that had we been better prepared, we could probably counter some of the effects of these disasters. Moving on, humanitarian coordination was seen as also an issue that was problematic. And this relates to the fact that international organizations will often parachute in as responders. This is what we do. We go into a conflict zone or an area that's been struck by an emergency. And sometimes, perhaps intentionally or unintentionally, we don't consult or perhaps coordinate as well as we should with local actors and with national institutions as well. So that's something we need to work on. And we also heard that localizing the response would be one way of effectively overcoming some of these problems. Again, governments were very vocal that state sovereignty and the responsibility of governments to provide aid and to care for their populations was an important principle that needs to be safeguarded. But at the same time, humanitarian organizations could do better in terms of strengthening local capacities to respond to conflict. There was also the issue of humanitarian actors doing what they could, or the perceived perception from some of our colleagues and constituents on the ground, to enhance or continue their mandates rather than do themselves out of a job, which is the ideal scenario. We were told that there was a competition for resources between international organizations and national organizations, and that once organizations get on the ground, they need to already be thinking about their exit strategy. As one colleague in Lebanon called it, he said there was a competition for these limited resources in what has become a humanitarian industry or humanitarian marketplace. There was also cited a lack of trust between national and international organizations and the need to ensure that transparency was better achieved, so that everyone was aware of what was happening and that we could better coordinate and cooperate in terms of meeting the needs of people on the ground. Moving on to the principles of humanitarian action, there was uniform acknowledgement, I think, about what these principles should be and the importance of impartiality being at the core of what we do. Unfortunately, a lot of the recipients of humanitarian aid and assistance didn't see it that way. In fact, a lot of them thought that instead of using these principles of humanitarian aid delivery, what was in fact being used to determine the criteria was things like ethnic affiliations, political affiliations, religious affiliations. Some even cited appearance, that if they didn't look disheveled enough and poor enough and miserable enough, that they should not be entitled to receive aid. And this was a message that came loud and clear from the communities we spoke to. The issue of humanitarian financing, I think we all know that needs in the region far outweigh the resources that we have to respond. And recognizing that, there was a call that we use the funding and the finances we have at our disposal to do better and to find new and innovative ways of mobilizing resources. There was also the feeling that aid money or financing was being disproportionately allocated to international organizations rather than local responders, and that this needs to be better balanced. We also heard that there should be more recognition of the tradition and culture of aid and charity, which has been in place for millennia in the Middle East and North Africa, and that mechanisms such as Islamic finance and engagement with the private sector needs to be looked at in a more serious way so that we can find new and alternative ways of funding some of the crises that are playing out in the region. The role of the media was particularly recognized by everyone we spoke to. The power that the media yields and holds in transmitting messages, in shaping the agenda, in targeting particular conflicts or drawing attention to certain areas, that was something that was uniformly seen as a powerful tool that we have not harnessed in the way that we can, and that more balance needs to be adopted in the way that that's done. And the media colleagues themselves also were not shy about sharing their views on how we as humanitarians have not been open enough and transparent enough and not willing to subject ourselves to scrutiny in the way that we provide information, in the way that we run our operations. So that was a very useful two-way dialogue, which we hope to now build on with continued discussions and perhaps even taking that forward in a different way. The role of youth, this was something that came across in every single consultation. We cannot deny the numbers, the demographic makeup of the region. The youth are an important constituency, and they are often among the first responders in communities. So there was a call for better harnessing that. The tradition of volunteerism is one that is long established in the region, but we need to find ways of perhaps better integrating or expanding those networks. There were even suggestions that we think about training youth formally for first response and humanitarian response, so that we can call on these important networks when they're required. And the last issue that was highlighted was migration. And I think all of us in this room know why that's been highlighted. We've watched with horror and shock as innocent civilians take perilous sea journeys and go often through multiple journeys where they face vulnerability, they face human traffickers, they face very unscrupulous people who will take advantage of their vulnerability and profit from that and put them on often unseaworthy vessels, and we have seen the results of that. Women and children and elderly people taking these dangerous journeys and perishing at sea. And we need to recognize what underpins that vulnerability. Why would people be driven to the extremes that would require them to put their children on these kinds of boats, and what it is that drives us, that desperation as parents, as people who face conflict, wanting to find something better for our families and secure a better future for our children. We need to be looking at that. And as one very eloquent young Syrian man told us in Lebanon, and I'm going to quote directly, "If you want to protect us from the sea, ensure that our dignity is protected on the ground." And I think that is an extremely powerful message. And I really hope that this concept of dignity, which was shared with us over and over and over again, that forms the very core of what we do over the next 2.5 days. And that we remember and we heed this call from the people that are affected by crisis in our region, that preserving dignity should be the goal. It should not be an afterthought. It is something that we need to do from the beginning of our response and integrate it throughout. Those were the main 11 issues coming out of the region. And as you know, those are very weighty, complex, very layered issues. And we could spend weeks and months discussing them. And in recognizing that we cannot do justice to all of these 11 issues, the Regional Steering Group took the decision to focus in for the next 2.5 days on the 6 that were most often raised. And you will see the 6 issues on the screens in front of you. These are not easy issues. And sadly, it is an honest representation of the issues and the problems and the challenges that we face in this region. So we will take the opportunity in the working group sessions, and Alia will brief you a little more on the methodology and what will happen in those groups, but these will be the 6 issues that we will ask you to focus on. And if I could just make a personal plea to everyone in this room, you have each been invited to this consultation because you have rich experience, you have made contributions to humanitarian action and humanitarian affairs in the region. You bring with you expertise, experience, a knowledge of the issues. We want to capitalize that and on your presence. You've come from many different places across the region, and we want to make sure that we use this opportunity to emerge from the MENA consultation with concrete, practical recommendations. As Jamila said, this is the 5th of 8. We want to ensure that we learn from the mistakes and build on the successes of the previous regional consultations. So I urge all of you to please use this opportunity to ensure that the voices of the people of our region are heard. They deserve to be heard, but they also need to be heard in a way that is concrete and practical to ensure that in Istanbul, the Middle East and North Africa and the proud people of this region are heard and have an opportunity to influence and shape their future and the way in which humanitarian aid is delivered. Thank you very much.